The dinner plate was still warm in my hands when my daughter-in-law snatched it without a glance. Still, I let go gently, no protest, just the quiet scrape of porcelain on skin. As the roasted herbs curled into the silence, I watched the steam vanish, unnoticed. While she laughed like it was her kitchen, I folded my napkin. Slow, precise. The same hands that served her for years now itched for something colder than kindness. That's when I knew. She hadn't taken the plate. She'd triggered the transfer. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. It was a quiet Sunday evening, the kind of stillness that settled over the house like dust. The kind Margaret had come to cherish after a long career spent in hospitals, where noise and chaos never stopped. In her hands, the roasting pan felt like a small triumph. Golden chicken, crispy skin, vegetables arranged just so. It wasn't anything special, but it was hers. It was her way of creating something beautiful out of the rhythm of everyday life. She carried the plate into the dining room with care, the aroma trailing behind her like a warm invitation. The table was set for four, as always, two empty places, and one too full, as usual. The chairs were positioned just so. Stephen, the son who had outgrown the need for table manners, usually sat at the head. Rachel, his polished wife, occupied the seat to his right. Then there was Ava, Margaret's granddaughter, who liked to sit at the end and pretend she was invisible. Margaret paused just inside the door, looking at the way Rachel had already positioned herself in the room. She knew what was coming, but she couldn't stop herself from hoping that just once it would be different. As Margaret approached the table ready to serve, Rachel stood abruptly, her eyes flashing with a practiced, polite smile. "I've got it. You've done enough," she said, her hand shooting out to intercept the plate mid-air. Margaret froze, the plate still in her hands, a faint tremor running through her fingers. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words clogged up in her throat. Instead, she blinked. Once, then again. A soft exhale, and she sat down in her own chair without a word, hands folded carefully in her lap. Stephen chuckled awkwardly, his gaze drifting back to his phone, but it wasn't enough to break the silence that descended between them. He didn't even notice the way Rachel's smile faltered or how Ava, from the other end of the table, was watching it all unfold with a mixture of confusion and something darker. Margaret could feel the weight of the room's collective discomfort. It pressed down on her chest, but she didn't rise to meet it. She couldn't. Ava's frown was sharp, and her voice broke through the tension like a knife. That was rude. Margaret glanced at her granddaughter, who was still staring at the scene with open distaste. Margaret's lips twisted in a faint smile, her eyes soft but resigned. So was the silence that followed, she replied quietly. She didn't add anything more, not for the first time, not for any of them. The conversation resumed, but it was stilted, as if the air itself had thickened. Margaret ate her meal without much enthusiasm, the taste of chicken suddenly flat, the vegetables cold and lifeless. She had fed them, had cooked for them, and yet, the serving, the offering, felt more like a chore than a gesture of love. Later, after the dishes were cleared, the night seemed to drag on. Margaret retreated to the quiet of her room, hoping for solitude. She opened the drawer marked Title, Whitaker Property, as if by instinct, fingers brushing over the small stack of papers inside, the ones that had always been there, just out of sight. She pulled out the folder, opened it slowly, and began flipping through the documents. A wave of satisfaction washed over her, steady and slow. It was all there. The contracts, the deeds, the terms of ownership. Proof of what had always been true, even when they pretended it wasn't. She had never truly let go. The house had always been hers, no matter how many years had passed. A faint buzz from her phone broke the silence. She glanced at the screen. A text from Joyce. Still letting them serve you disrespect? Margaret's lips curved into a small, private smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She didn't need to respond. Joyce had always known. Margaret set the phone down, staring at the papers for a long moment. She could almost feel the house waiting for her, the walls echoing with the weight of decisions yet to come. But tonight, there would be no confrontation, no rush. She would wait. And when the time was right, when the pieces had fallen into place, they would all know. The keys would be hers to return. The sound of her granddaughter's footsteps down the hall brought Margaret back to the present. Ava appeared in the doorway, her face soft, uncertain. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Margaret nodded, closing the folder with a deliberate motion. She turned to look at Ava, her eyes clear and steady. "I'm not the one packing," she said, her voice low but firm. Ava didn't say anything more, but she stayed there just for a moment longer, before quietly disappearing back down the hallway. Margaret let the silence hang in the air for a while longer before rising from her chair. She knew what was coming. It always did. The plate had cracked. The table had been set. But soon it would be her turn to return what had been taken. The house had always been a subtle power struggle. Margaret remembered the day it began, the moment when Stephen and Rachel, having been denied the loan for their dream home, came to her with pleading eyes. It was supposed to be temporary, just a helping hand. They had been embarrassed. Rachel, polished and perfect on the outside, had a hard time showing it. Stephen, always conflict avoidant, barely spoke at all. "I can't let them go to a rental," Margaret had said to Joyce at the time, sitting in the worn-out kitchen of her own home, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. "They'll lose their dignity." The deal they struck was simple. Margaret would finance the house, using the money from her own savings. The loan would be in her name, but they would cover the property taxes, an arrangement that would keep things neat, clean, and unquestioned. The agreement had been a promise, an unwritten understanding that her family would respect the gift, would appreciate it, would never forget who had made it possible. But over the years, it had become less of a gift and more of a leash. She had always kept quiet about the fact that her name was on the title, that she held a silent claim to everything. Every repair, every renovation, every seemingly trivial decision in the house had gone unnoticed by them. Margaret never spoke up, never reminded them. But she had never truly let go. It wasn't just a house, it was a boundary that had been erased. A mistake she'd allowed, for the sake of family harmony, for the sake of keeping things smooth. And then came Rachel's smooth, dismissive comment at dinner. Margaret could feel it deep in her bones the moment the plate had cracked. It was a small gesture, but it had been the tipping point. She couldn't pretend anymore, not with the house, not with her own dignity. Later that night, Margaret opened the drawer marked title, Whitaker property again, as if the papers themselves might hold some kind of explanation, an apology, a way to make everything right again. The folder was simple, old-fashioned even, just a manila envelope with her name neatly typed across the front. She pulled it out, the familiar weight of it in her hands. It hadn't been touched in years, not since the paperwork was signed. But it felt different now, heavier. A knock on the door broke her concentration. It was Joyce, her oldest friend. Margaret hadn't told her yet. Joyce had been a sounding board over the years, always ready with a no-nonsense perspective. Joyce didn't believe in secrets, and she wasn't afraid to tell Margaret when she thought she was being too passive. "You've been too quiet about this, Marg," Joyce said as she stepped into the room, her voice tinged with a knowing edge. "You gave them a gift. They turned it into a leash." Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply held up the folder. Joyce, understanding, gave a low whistle. "You're still on title?" Margaret nodded, her lips tight. "I never took my name off the deed. I thought it would be fine, but it's not. Not anymore." Joyce crossed the room, settling beside her on the bed. "Then what are you going to do about it?" Margaret's hand rested on the folder, fingers tracing the paper. She paused, feeling the full weight of her decision for the first time. "I'll take the keys. And the leash." Joyce's eyes flashed, a glint of approval hidden behind the sharpness. "Good," she said. "You can still take back what's yours." The next morning, Margaret called Miriam Lang, the property lawyer she had worked with years ago. She knew Miriam would give her no-nonsense advice, nothing sugar-coated. Miriam didn't waste time on pleasantries. Margaret sat at the kitchen table looking out at the yard, the sun low in the sky, shadows creeping into the corners of the room. It felt like the calm before a storm. When Miriam answered, Margaret didn't waste words. The title, "I Need It," changed. There was a pause on the other end, followed by Miriam's deliberate response. "You're still on the deed. You know that, right?" Margaret took a steadying breath. "Yes, I want to reclaim the house." Quietly. There was a brief silence before Miriam replied. "Do you want me to file it formally? Get the ball rolling?" Margaret's voice was soft but firm. "Yes, quietly. I don't want them to know until it's done." "You got it," Miriam said, a hint of approval in her voice. Margaret hung up the phone and sat there for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling into her bones. Quietly. It would all happen quietly, like a whisper in the night. A change so subtle that they wouldn't even know what had happened until the keys were in her hands. But the more Margaret thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't just reclaiming the house. She was reclaiming herself. The years of silence, of walking on eggshells around her son and daughter-in-law, had come to an end. The keys, those keys, would be hers to return, when the time was right. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Margaret arrived at the house that had once felt like a sanctuary, a place where she had hoped to build something lasting for her family. But now, standing at the kitchen doorway, she watched as Rachel effortlessly hosted a yoga brunch for her group, her arms sweeping dramatically as she plated slices of quiche and arranged delicate glasses of lemonade. The scent of fresh-baked bread and herbal tea mingled with the air, filling the space like it had become Rachel's natural domain. Margaret lingered in the entryway, silently observing, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She hadn't been invited, and she knew better than to step in. This was Rachel's moment, her performance, her show of ownership. Rachel moved with purpose. Her bright smile turned to every guest like a beacon. "Everything's fresh, just from the farmer's market this morning," she announced. "I love having the space to cook for everyone. Nothing beats entertaining in my kitchen." Margaret bit back the instinct to correct her, to remind her of the reality, but she held her ground. Instead, she let the words fall like distant echoes around her, empty and weightless. The house, once a shared place of memories, now felt like a stage set for Rachel's every curated move. Rachel glanced up as she worked, catching Margaret's eye for a fleeting second before diverting her attention to the yoga group's chatter. Margaret nodded quietly, a silent acknowledgement that she wasn't part of this narrative anymore. She wasn't part of Rachel's show. A familiar voice broke the silence in the room. Joyce had entered through the back door, her sharp eyes immediately taking in the scene. "Nice spread," Joyce said, giving a small nod toward Rachel's efforts. She motioned to the pie resting on the counter, its flaky crust just slightly askew. "That pie looks familiar." Margaret turned her head to glance at Joyce, and her lips tugged at the corner of a smile. "Because I baked it," she said, her voice low but calm. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet resignation, like she was looking at a piece of herself being served up on a platter, but it didn't belong to her anymore. Joyce's lips parted in a soft sigh, and she placed her hand gently on Margaret's shoulder. "You're letting her do this?" Joyce asked, the question threading a note of disbelief in the air. Margaret didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped quietly into the room, her feet light on the hardwood floor. As Rachel offered another guest a second serving of food, Margaret moved around the table, collecting the empty dishes that no one had even bothered to clear. Ava watched from the corner of the room, her gaze following Margaret's movements. She was silent, but her eyes were full of questions. Margaret could feel the weight of her granddaughter's unspoken thoughts as she wiped down the table, hands moving mechanically. Joyce's voice broke the tension. "When are you going to tell them?" Margaret didn't look up. She carefully placed a fork into the sink, running water over it as she responded, her tone deliberate and measured. "They'll know when the keys land back in their hands." Joyce didn't say anything more, but she didn't have to. The words hung in the air, sharp as a knife. Margaret wasn't going to fight. She wasn't going to create a scene. It would be quiet, controlled. And when it was time, Rachel and Stephen would realize that what they thought they owned was never really theirs to begin with. As Margaret finished cleaning the table, a faint shiver ran through her, the action feeling almost mechanical, like she was preparing for something bigger, something final. Later that evening, after Rachel's guests had trickled out, Margaret found herself alone in her study, the silence of the house pressing in around her. The papers in front of her felt heavy, but the action she was about to take was necessary. With slow, deliberate fingers, she pulled open the drawer where she had kept her will, where she had filed away every decision she had made for years, hiding her true intentions in plain sight. She reached for the pen, and as she signed her name, there was a subtle sense of finality in the movement, a quiet but unmistakable shift. She had removed Stephen from his role as the executor of her estate, no longer willing to trust him with what had once been his birthright. The house would no longer be part of his inheritance. It would go to someone who would honor it, who would understand the value of what it meant, not just in terms of property, but in love, effort, and respect. As she set the pen down, Margaret looked at the paper in front of her, the weight of the decision settling in. She hadn't done it out of anger. Not entirely. No, this was about dignity. Her own, and the one she had so often set aside for the sake of keeping the peace. Her thoughts were interrupted by a light knock at the door. Ava stood in the doorway, watching her with those observant eyes, so much older than her years. "Are you okay?" Ava asked, her voice soft but full of understanding. Margaret nodded without saying a word, a slight smile crossing her lips. "I'm fine," Margaret said, "just doing what's needed." Ava didn't push any further but lingered in the doorway for a moment longer before turning to leave. Margaret remained seated, the weight of the document still fresh in her hands. As the door clicked shut behind her, Margaret stared at the papers before her, knowing that her path was set. The house, once a place of warmth and family, would soon be passed on. Not to the ones who thought it was theirs, but to those who understood the true meaning of home. She had made the first move. Now, there was no turning back. The door slammed open with a force that rattled the old wood of the frame. Rachel stood there, her face flushed with anger, an envelope clenched tightly in her hand like a weapon. The paper crinkled in her grip, a stark contrast to the sleek composure she usually maintained. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice a sharp slice through the stillness of the kitchen. She didn't wait for an answer, her eyes already scanning the text on the letter as if it held the key to a mystery she was desperate to unravel. Margaret didn't move. She was seated at the kitchen table, hands folded, her expression calm as the silence stretched between them. The weight of the moment settled like dust in the air. She had known this was coming. It was only a matter of time before Rachel found out. "A gentle reminder," Margaret said quietly, her voice low but clear. She didn't need to raise it. She had no interest in being loud, no desire to escalate. The truth was simple, and it would be clear soon enough. Rachel's lips twisted in disbelief, and she slammed the letter down onto the table, the paper fluttering as it landed. Gentle reminder? This is a legal notice, Margaret. What the hell is this? Her fingers jabbed at the paper like she could push the words back into the page. You can't just... Stephen's voice interrupted from the doorway, calm but cautious, like a man who had already seen the storm brewing but hadn't quite figured out where to stand. Wait, is this legal? His eyes were darting between Margaret and Rachel, his voice betraying the uncertainty that had taken root in him over the past few days. Margaret leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. She looked up at Stephen, meeting his gaze steadily. It was from the beginning. She paused, giving him a moment to absorb the meaning behind her words. When neither of them spoke, she continued, her voice steady and sure. I financed the house. The loan was in my name. I was always the one on the title, always the one with the rights. The transfer was made clear to you both when I signed the documents. It's all there. Rachel's face twisted with rage, her eyes narrowing, her breath quickening. You've had this power all along, haven't you? She spat, her voice low and dangerous. And you've been lying to us for years. Margaret met her anger with calm, unflinching. I didn't lie, she said softly. I just didn't remind you. A beat of silence passed between them, thick with the weight of unspoken years. Rachel shook her head, her shoulders stiff. We've lived here for 6 years, Margaret. 6 years. The words tumbled out, carrying the full weight of the time Rachel had spent in what she had believed was her home. You never said a word. You just let us think we were safe, that we had a home. Margaret didn't flinch. And I've paid for it for 7, she replied, the words simple but cutting. Her voice had softened, but the truth in it was sharp and undeniable. Every payment, every tax, every inch of this house has come from my hands. I didn't ask for anything in return, except respect. Rachel's face was red now, her fingers trembling slightly as she gripped the letter tighter. So what now? You just take it back? The question was biting like a taunt, but there was fear in her voice, something Margaret hadn't expected. I'm not taking it back, Margaret said, the steadiness of her voice a stark contrast to Rachel's frantic energy. I'm just giving it back. Rachel looked as though she was going to snap, her body tense, her jaw clenched, ready to explode. But instead, she took a breath, her eyes flicking to Stephen, then back to Margaret. She couldn't process it all, not in the way she wanted to, not in the way that would release the rage building inside her. Stephen's gaze was troubled, his silence louder than anything Rachel could say. He hadn't understood what was happening, not yet, not the way Margaret had intended. He was still thinking about the house as something they had been given, something to hold, to claim, to take for granted. He hadn't yet recognized that the house wasn't a gift. It was a loan. A loan with no expiration date until Margaret said so. Margaret stood up slowly, moving toward the counter where the letter still sat, the edges crinkled from Rachel's tight grip. She looked at the paper for a moment, but her eyes were already somewhere else, focused on the decision she had made long ago, the decision that had brought her here, to this point, to this moment. You don't have to understand, Margaret said softly, but you will. Rachel opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. Instead, she looked at Stephen, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. The house, the power, the years of silence, they all hung between them, thick and heavy, pressing down on their shoulders. Is it really too late for us to make this right? Stephen asked finally, his voice breaking through the tension. a note of genuine confusion creeping into his tone. Margaret's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. She had always been the one to make things right, to smooth over the rough edges. But not this time. This time, it was their turn to learn. "No," Margaret said quietly, "but you'll have to wait until I'm ready." And with that, she turned away, leaving the two of them standing in the kitchen, unsure of what would come next. Margaret's back was straight, her footsteps deliberate. But something else was stirring in her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now, the first true sense of release. The letter, and the house, had never really been theirs. And soon, they would understand that too. The night stretched on, quiet but heavy. From the kitchen, the glow of the fridge light illuminated the counter where Rachel had scattered a collection of legal websites and eviction laws, her eyes flicking rapidly over the text, her mind working in overdrive. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo louder with every passing second. She clicked through pages, flipping between tabs, searching for something, anything, that might give her a way out of the truth that had settled like a stone in her chest. Her fingers trembled slightly as she skimmed through case laws, trying to make sense of the words. Tenant rights, notice of eviction, unauthorized occupancy. There had to be something, some loophole that would let her stay, let her reclaim control over what she had convinced herself was hers. Her eyes narrowed as she typed furiously, her breath shallow. But the truth was undeniable. She had no right to fight this. Not anymore. A soft, hesitant knock at the doorframe broke the tension. Stephen stood there, phone in hand, his face pale in the soft light of the kitchen. "I called the lawyer," he said quietly, his voice more defeated than Rachel had ever heard it. "She confirmed it. The house is Margaret's. 100%. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She tried to swallow, but the dryness in her throat made it hard to breathe, let alone speak. The weight of his words sank in, dragging her down like a stone. 100%. The house wasn't a gift. It had never been theirs to claim. Stephen didn't seem to notice her lack of response. He just stood there, staring at the floor, his mind working as if trying to fix a problem that had already shattered beyond repair. "I don't know what to do," he muttered. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. She wanted to scream, to unleash all of the frustration and betrayal she felt, but her words stuck, her voice trapped in the cage of her own disbelief. Instead, she slammed her laptop shut, the noise sharp and final. The quiet that followed was suffocating. Later that night, after an agonizing silence had filled their bedroom, Rachel found herself pacing in the hallway, the house creaking around her like it was waking up to betray her. She walked by the living room, the furniture, the paintings, the shelves, each piece reminding her of the life she thought she had built here. Her footsteps echoed in the hall, and as she turned the corner, she almost collided with Margaret. The older woman stood at the top of the stairs, watching her with quiet eyes. Rachel didn't wait for an invitation. She couldn't hold it back any longer. "This is payback, isn't it?" She spat, the words sharp and venomous, her voice tight with frustration. "You've been biding your time, waiting for the moment to strike, to take back what's yours." Margaret didn't flinch. Her posture was calm, as though she had expected this confrontation, had known it was coming. "No," she replied, her voice low but steady, cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. "This is correction." Rachel's eyes blazed with indignation. "Correction?" Her laugh was bitter, edged with disbelief. "You've ruined everything. You've taken everything from us." Margaret met her gaze, her expression unwavering. "I haven't ruined anything. I've given you a chance to learn what it means to truly own something." Her voice softened, but the strength in it was unmistakable. "I gave you everything I could, but you never understood. You thought this house was a prize, a trophy, But it's not. It's a responsibility. It was always meant to be mine, to give or take. The words landed with finality, but Rachel wasn't ready to hear them. She turned on her heel, heading for the stairs, her footsteps angry and reckless. As Rachel disappeared up the stairs, Margaret stood still, her eyes lingering on the dark hallway, the echo of footsteps fading into silence. She didn't feel satisfaction. No, not yet. But she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: clarity. Hours later, in the quiet of her room, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, the glow of her phone casting a faint light on her face. She glanced at the screen, seeing Joyce's name flashing across the display. She had expected the call. Margaret answered, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling in her mind. "Margaret," Joyce's voice came through, thick with the weight of their shared history. "You're doing the right thing. You know that, don't you? Keys don't jingle forever in the wrong hands." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over her, and a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Joyce had always understood. "I do," Margaret said quietly. "But it's hard, Joyce, watching them lose something they thought was theirs. Hard, yes, but necessary. They'll get it in time, and when they do, it'll be a lesson, one they'll never forget." Margaret didn't respond, but the comfort of Joyce's words settled into her, like a warm cloak wrapping around her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this, and that thought steadied her. "I'll call you tomorrow," Joyce continued, "and I'll be there, when it's time." Margaret nodded, though Joyce couldn't see it. "I'll be ready." As she ended the call and laid the phone down on the nightstand, Margaret glanced at the empty space beside her. The house, the key, and the decision had been made. The night was far from over, but tomorrow would bring the next step, one that would shake the foundation of everything Rachel and Stephen had taken for granted. But for now, Margaret allowed herself a moment of peace. There was no turning back. The doorbell rang just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a faint orange glow across the living room. Margaret was seated by the window, watching as the courier approached. She didn't rise to answer it, didn't need to. The moment had arrived. The envelope, pale and unremarkable, was slid through the mail slot. It landed softly on the welcome mat with a faint thud, almost too quiet to notice. But Margaret saw it, her eyes narrowing as she stood, slowly making her way to the door. With one deliberate motion, she picked up the envelope. Her fingers traced the edges of the seal, a simple decision made long ago, now final in its execution. She held it for a moment longer, feeling the weight of it in her hands before opening it. Inside, the notice was short, formal, and cold. Change in authorized occupancy. Margaret read through the document, her face calm, betraying nothing of the thoughts behind her steady gaze. The letter was official, and everything had been documented. Miriam's name was there at the bottom, confirming that the legal actions were all within her rights. Rachel's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and dismissive from the other room. "She's bluffing," Rachel scoffed, pacing back and forth. Margaret didn't answer immediately, but the small smile that tugged at the corner of her lips spoke volumes. She wasn't bluffing. A moment later, Stephen joined Rachel in the living room, his steps hesitant. He glanced at the notice in Margaret's hand, and the color drained from his face when he saw Miriam's name on the letter. He hadn't thought it would come to this. He hadn't understood. "She can legally reclaim the home," he said, his voice distant, as though trying to rationalize it. "Immediately." Rachel's face twisted in disbelief. "You're letting her do this, Stephen? She's taking everything from us. Do you understand that?" But Stephen didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the paper, his mind still processing what it all meant. In the back of his mind, he had always believed the house belonged to them, that his mother's generosity had been an unspoken agreement. But now it was clear. The house had never truly been theirs. It was a lease with an end date he hadn't seen coming. Meanwhile, Margaret, ever the quiet force in the room, was already moving. She wasn't packing. No, she wasn't leaving anything behind. She was deciding. The basement door creaked open and she descended the stairs slowly, her hands brushing over the boxes she had once labeled with care. She hadn't rushed the decision, but now that it had been made, there was no hesitation. In the dim light of the basement, Margaret moved methodically. She sorted through the few belongings she would take with her. An old chair, a lamp, objects that felt like fragments of a life that had been carefully built and slowly dismantled. There was no urgency in her movements, no panic. Just a quiet certainty. Ava appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her presence a silent question. Margaret didn't need to explain. Ava simply stepped forward and began folding linens, her hands moving with practiced grace. She didn't ask why. She understood, in her own way, that this wasn't about the house anymore. This was about Margaret reclaiming what she had always quietly held. Ava paused as she carefully folded a blanket, looking up at her grandmother with an expression that was both curious and cautious. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice gentle, careful not to disturb the calm. Margaret nodded, her face betraying no emotion. She was at peace. "I'm not the one packing," she replied simply, her eyes meeting Ava's. The weight of those words settled over both of them, a quiet reminder of what had been lost and what was about to be returned. Upstairs, Rachel continued to pace, frustration building in her chest. She couldn't stop the swirl of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't care what that paper says," she muttered to herself, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. "I won't just walk away. We deserve more than this." But there was no more fight left in her. The truth was too clear now. Margaret had given them a house. And now, Margaret was taking it back. There was no fight left to be won. A voicemail notification buzzed through Margaret's phone, the sound sharp and insistent in the quiet house. She picked up the phone and read the message, the familiar voice of Joyce ringing in her ear. "Margaret, it's me," Joyce's voice came through, the words soft, but laced with understanding. "Keys don't jingle forever in the wrong hands. You've done the right thing. You've waited, and now it's your turn. Do it with dignity. Make them hand you what they clutched without gratitude." Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting Joyce's words settle in. The tension in her chest, the weight of the decision, was finally beginning to lift. She wasn't angry anymore. Not at Rachel, not at Stephen. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about clarity, about doing what was necessary no matter how painful. She turned her attention back to the basement, the quiet of the space wrapping around her like a cocoon. Soon it would be over. The keys, the house, the responsibility, all would be returned. In the end, it wasn't about possession. It was about stewardship. And Margaret had carried that weight long enough. "Not much longer now," she whispered to herself, her voice soft but final. She could feel the change in the air, the weight of the moment settling like a final breath. The keys would soon be handed over. The house was empty now, but not quiet. The echoes of footsteps, voices, and the soft hum of daily life lingered in the walls, even as Margaret stood in the center of the living room, surveying the space. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the faint remnants of meals shared, arguments made, and decisions left to linger. She could feel the weight of it all, the years spent here, the laughter, the resentments, the expectations. It wasn't a home anymore, not in the way it once had been. And yet, as Margaret moved through the rooms, she didn't feel the sting of abandonment. No, there was something else, something quieter. This house, once a place she'd poured her love into, had now become a stage for a performance she no longer wished to watch. The walls were mostly bare now, a few paintings left in their places but without their meaning. The furniture was arranged just so, but it was all sterile now, cleaned, polished, but unthoughtful. It was as though the space had been stripped of its heart, its warmth, in an attempt to make it something it wasn't. A message in itself. Margaret's footsteps were soft on the hardwood floors, the click of her shoes almost drowned by the deep silence of the house. She moved methodically, not rushing through the rooms but taking in each detail. The kitchen, where so many meals had been made, was empty now, save for the remnants of a life once shared. The countertops were clear, the cabinets closed, everything in its place, two in place. She turned into the pantry, where the shelves were stocked with canned goods and dried pasta. But there, tucked behind a box of cereal, she found it. Her mother's tea set, the delicate china, so fragile, so beautiful, hidden away, forgotten in the shuffle of belongings that had been hastily packed. Margaret stood still for a moment, staring at the set as if it had been misplaced or ignored by accident. The tea set had been her mother's, something handed down with the kind of care only a daughter could understand. It wasn't something Rachel had ever cared for, and Margaret knew that. It had never fit with the glossy, polished world Rachel had created for herself here. Without a word, Margaret reached down, gently lifting the tea set and placing it back on the shelf of the dining cabinet. Center shelf, as it had always been, the proper place. She took a moment to admire it, the familiar floral pattern etched in gold, the delicate cups that had once held so many quiet conversations. It felt right there, the way it always had. And for a moment, Margaret allowed herself to breathe. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from the stillness. She pulled it out and saw Ava's name on the screen, a simple text. "Can I still visit?" Margaret smiled softly as she read it, her heart tightening. Ava had been a constant presence through all of this. Even now, when the dust was settling and the house had been emptied of its contents, Ava remained. She typed a quick reply. "You were never the problem." A deep sigh escaped Margaret as she looked around the room, her eyes tracing the now barren walls. It wasn't a home for her anymore, not like it used to be. It was a place where she had given too much of herself, expecting things to stay the same, expecting things to be appreciated. But she had learned that sometimes the most difficult lesson was knowing when to let go, when to reclaim what was always yours. As she walked through the house one last time, her fingers grazing the furniture, the door frames, the banister, she knew there would be no going back. The house wasn't just a place, it was a reminder, a symbol. And now, it would be a memory. Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from Joyce. Her voice came through, steady and warm. "You want to live there again?" Margaret stopped in the hallway, her hand resting on the banister. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting Joyce's voice settle around her. "No," Margaret replied softly, almost to herself. "I just wanted them to remember who let them in." The words hung in the air, a quiet truth that only Margaret fully understood. This wasn't about reclaiming a house. It was about making sure they never forgot the cost of what they took for granted. Margaret turned and walked toward the front door, the echo of her footsteps the only sound in the house. She paused at the threshold, looking back one last time. The keys, her keys, were still in her pocket, ready to be returned. But the house would never be the same again. Not for Rachel, not for Stephen, and certainly not for her. The door closed softly behind her. Margaret hadn't expected to feel this light. The day was crisp, the kind of autumn afternoon where the sun flirts with the horizon just enough to turn everything golden, but never fully lets go. It was the perfect time for a change. And as Margaret stood at the entrance of Magnolia Bridge, the independent living facility that had accepted her application, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to in years: hope. The building stood before her, not imposing, but welcoming. A craftsman-style bungalow, its windows wide and open, surrounded by well-tended gardens and the scent of fresh flowers. Nothing like the sterile, empty house she'd just left behind. It wasn't the grand home she had once imagined living in forever, but there was a quiet dignity to it that spoke to Margaret's need for simplicity. She didn't need grandeur anymore. She needed peace. Inside, the unit was bright and airy, painted in soft, neutral tones. The space felt private, almost cocoon-like, with a small kitchen tucked to one side, the living room wide enough to invite comfort without overwhelming. The bedroom was tucked away, as though it had always belonged to her. She walked through it slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty room. It was hers. Just hers. No more shared spaces, no more whispered resentment, no more taking care of everyone else's needs while her own were left in the shadows. The walls had already been marked by someone's kindness, the floorboards gently scuffed by footsteps that weren't hers, but could be. She ran her fingers along the surface of the dining table, eyes scanning the room. No, this wasn't a house that had been shared. A home that had been claimed by someone else. This was Margaret's place, where she could breathe again. She signed the lease without hesitation, the pen moving fluidly across the paper, a quiet declaration of independence. Her hand didn't tremble. This wasn't a decision made in a rush. It was the calm realization that she had been waiting for this moment for years, perhaps even decades. The last of the paperwork was completed, and Margaret paid the full amount for the year, prepaid and settled. As she handed over the final documents, the property manager smiled at her warmly. "We're thrilled to have you, Mrs. Whitaker. I'll get your keys ready for you right away." Margaret nodded with a small smile of her own. "Thank you." The words felt lighter than they had in years. When she left the office, the early evening air hit her like a soft sigh, cooling the warmth that had built inside her. There was no rush, no place to be, only the space to step into something new. Later that evening, Margaret sat on her old couch, the one that had been sitting empty in the house for the past few days, waiting for a move that had finally come. Joyce arrived with a few of her things, the items that had been packed up from the house: a lamp, an old quilt, a framed picture of her children, the books she had always read before bed. Joyce had helped coordinate the delivery, and though the bags were light, each object felt heavy with meaning. Each item was part of the life Margaret was leaving behind, but also part of the life she was carrying with her. "You're really doing it, huh?" Joyce said, her voice full of something like awe and concern. A mixture of admiration and the knowledge of how hard this was. Margaret smiled, her eyes soft with the weight of it. "I never wanted to keep the house, Joyce," she said quietly, looking at the box of framed photos she had just unpacked. "I wanted to release it on my terms, and now I can." Joyce didn't speak immediately, but instead moved across the room, placing a cup of tea in front of Margaret. They sat together in the growing darkness of the room, the quiet hum of the evening outside surrounding them. There were no more loud footsteps, no more bustle of family filling the house. There was just silence. It was strange, but Margaret felt more at peace in it than she had in years. That night, after Joyce had left, Margaret sat at the window, watching the world outside settle into its own rhythm. The garden was full of color, vibrant in the fading light of the evening, the path to the small unit lit softly by lamplight. The air was cold now, and the house, this house, felt warmer, smaller, more welcoming than anything she'd left behind. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She stood slowly, crossing the room to answer it. When she opened it, there was Ava, standing with a quiet smile, her bag slung over her shoulder. "Can I come in?" Ava asked softly, her voice full of something that Margaret recognized as both youthful curiosity and silent understanding. Margaret stepped aside, letting her granddaughter into the apartment. Ava set her bag down by the door, looking around the new space with the same careful observation she had always had. "Can I still visit?" Ava asked, her voice unsure. Margaret smiled, her heart heavy but full. "You were never the problem," she replied, gesturing toward the living room. Ava sat on the couch, a soft sigh escaping her as she settled in. For a moment, Margaret stood, watching her, feeling the shift between them, the understanding that Ava was one of the few who had truly seen her, who had always known what was behind her calm exterior. They didn't speak right away. Margaret knew there would be time for that. For now, there was peace. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret allowed herself to rest. Margaret hadn't expected the silence to feel this loud. The days that followed the move into Magnolia Bridge were strange in their quiet. The house, now left behind, felt like a distant memory, a ghost in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite shake. Every time she turned on the television or flipped through a book, there was a quiet echo of the life she had lived there. But it was just that, an echo. Rachel, of course, wasn't silent for long. The first voicemail came a few days after Margaret had settled in. Rachel's voice, normally smooth and polished, was jagged with emotion. "You've ruined everything, Margaret. Do you understand that? Everything I've built, you've just taken it away from me." The words dripped with bitterness, and there was a shaky breath at the end, like she was on the verge of crying. Margaret listened to it once, twice. Then she deleted it, just as she had done with the other voicemails that had come flooding in since the day Margaret had left the house. They were a mixture of anger, frustration, and, somewhere deep underneath it all, guilt. Rachel couldn't seem to decide if she was furious or regretful. And it unsettled Margaret in a way she couldn't fully explain. Another message arrived the next day. Rachel's voice this time was thinner, quieter, like she was trying to convince herself of something. "I can't believe you're doing this, Mom. You were the one who promised us. You gave us everything. And now I'm losing it all." A pause. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." Margaret set the phone down, her fingers lingering over the screen as the final words of Rachel's message slipped into the silence of the room. What was Rachel supposed to feel? Margaret wondered. Regret? Remorse? Or was it just the sting of realizing that the house had never been theirs to begin with? She didn't reply. She wouldn't reply. No response could undo what had already been done. The next day, Stephen sent her an email. It was short, direct, and, Margaret thought, almost childishly formal. "Can we meet in person?" The simplicity of it, the starkness of his request stung more than it should have. Stephen had always been the peacekeeper, the one who tried to smooth over the cracks. But now the cracks were too wide, too deep, and he had no idea how to begin filling them. Margaret didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence was a language she understood better than any words could express. Later that week, there was a knock at the door, followed by the familiar, steady rhythm of Joyce's voice. "Plant delivery," Joyce called as she stepped inside, her arms carrying a small, vibrant potted fern, its fronds reaching outward, alive with color. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, offering Joyce a quiet smile as she took the plant and placed it on the small dining table by the window. Joyce stepped in with the kind of quiet determination Margaret had come to rely on, her presence as grounding as ever. "I thought you could use a little life around here," Joyce said softly, settling into a chair with a sigh. "This place is lovely, Margaret, really, but it still feels a little empty. I thought we could fix that." Margaret's lips twisted into a smile, the corners of her eyes crinkling with a soft, silent amusement. You think a plant will do that? I think a plant's a good start, Joyce replied, her voice warm but knowing. And besides, it's better than silence. Margaret didn't respond to that. Instead, she glanced at the plant, a small but steady presence in the corner of the room. It was true, what Joyce said. There had been an emptiness in her life for a long time, but it wasn't a silence that could be filled by plants or trinkets. It was a silence she had paid for, one that had settled in the corners of her heart, the price of years spent in someone else's house, tending to their needs, to their expectations. A few hours later, as the sunlight outside began to fade into the quiet embrace of evening, Ava arrived with a bag of groceries, her arms filled with books. She set them down on the counter with a heavy sigh, as though the weight of the world had followed her through the door. I brought you food, Ava said, looking up at Margaret with a familiar, uncertain expression. And some books, in case you feel like reading. Margaret smiled gently, but there was something unreadable in her expression as she took the bag from Ava's arms. Thank you, she said softly. She couldn't explain to Ava what was happening, what had happened. Not yet. But Ava didn't ask. She didn't need to. Ava sat down at the table, her fingers picking at the edges of a book cover, a question in her eyes. So, are you really okay? She asked quietly. Because I don't think Mom gets it. Margaret's gaze softened as she sat across from her granddaughter, letting her words settle into the space between them. She thought access was inheritance, Margaret said slowly, her voice low. She thought the house would be hers, that it was a gift that she could keep. But it wasn't. Ava frowned, clearly puzzled. What was it then? Margaret didn't hesitate. It was a loan, with no interest. Until now. Ava looked down at the table, her fingers curling around the edge of the book. She didn't speak for a long time, and Margaret let the silence hang there. For once not a burden, but a moment of understanding. They didn't need to fill the space with anything else. Not yet. But maybe one day. For now, Margaret allowed herself a quiet breath, settling into the peace she had earned. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of the silence and the truth come home. Margaret had spent the entire morning preparing herself, carefully selecting her best blouse, the one that had always made her feel professional, composed, capable. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about showing up for herself, for once. She looked at herself in the mirror as she buttoned the blouse, smoothing it over her shoulders, her fingers brushing the fabric like she could feel the weight of what was to come. It had been weeks since she'd moved into Magnolia Bridge, weeks since she'd reclaimed her life and begun to find the quiet dignity she'd been missing for so long. But now, there was a new kind of responsibility waiting for her. One she hadn't anticipated, but one she knew she needed to embrace. Today, she would speak. Joyce, as always, was by her side, offering the support that felt as natural as breathing. You've got this, she said, her voice steady and calm as they stood at the door, about to leave. Just speak from the heart, that's all anyone needs to hear. Margaret nodded, the familiar flutter of nerves settling in her stomach. This wasn't a speech for an audience she could control. This wasn't just family or friends. Today, she would speak to people who had come to hear her story, her truth. No filters, no apologies. Just the raw, quiet force that had lived inside her for so long. They arrived at the community center where the event was being held, a small but significant gathering of people who had supported the nonprofit organization Margaret had worked with for years. The room was filled with warm lighting, neatly arranged chairs, and tables filled with people who had all come together to hear about housing rights, about stewardship, about responsibility, not just ownership. Margaret's heart began to beat a little faster as she walked to the podium, her steps deliberate but steady. The crowd hushed when she reached the microphone. She could feel every gaze on her, the expectation in the air, but there was something else there too, something kind. She felt the space open up in front of her, and without a word, she began. Housing is not just shelter. It's stewardship, Margaret said, her voice clear and strong. There was no hesitation, no searching for the right words. The truth had been inside her for so long that it poured out with ease. We build homes for our families, for our children, for ourselves. But we forget that home is not a right. It's a responsibility, a duty. When we take it for granted, we risk losing the very thing we believe we own. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. The crowd was silent, but Margaret could feel the attention on her, the connection. She knew they were listening. She wasn't just telling them about a house. She was telling them about what it meant to truly care for something, not just give it away or take it for granted, but to tend to it, to care for it, as if it were a living, breathing entity. I spent years caring for something that wasn't mine to keep, she continued, her voice softening, yet carrying the weight of her experience. I gave, and I gave, and I watched it become something it was never meant to be. But I didn't take it back out of spite. I took it back because I understood that a house is more than just walls and a roof. It's about dignity, about respect. The room was still. The quiet was deafening, but it was a good quiet. It was a quiet that had felt like a long time coming. And then, slowly, the applause began. First, one set of hands, and then another, until it was a wave of recognition, a standing ovation that rose up around her, full of respect, full of gratitude for the courage it had taken to say the things she had just said. Margaret stood there for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces that had all listened so intently, faces that now stood in acknowledgement. But in the back of her mind, she could still hear the faint echo of Rachel's words, the bitterness that had laced them, the fury. She stepped down from the podium, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was something else there too, a strange, unfamiliar feeling, relief. Ava, ever the silent witness, stood in the back of the room, her phone in hand, recording the moment. Her eyes were full of admiration, but there was a small flicker of something else, a pride that only a granddaughter could feel, watching a woman who had quietly changed the course of her life. Later that evening, as Margaret sat back in the apartment, the silence wrapping around her once more, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ava. Mom found the video. She's pissed. She says you're acting like a victim. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She placed the phone down beside her, a soft smile forming as she thought of Ava's words. Then she replied, her fingers tapping the screen. No, I'm just finally not playing the servant. The message sat there, a quiet testament to the shift that had occurred in both their lives. The next day, Margaret received a handwritten thank you card from the nonprofit's board. It was simple, but the words were clear. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for your courage. The card sat on her table, a reminder of everything that had led her here. It wasn't a thank you for the house, for the money, or for anything material. It was a thank you for showing up, for speaking out, for standing tall. Margaret folded the card, placed it in a drawer, and exhaled deeply. The truth had been spoken. The world had heard her. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt whole. The keys were hers to return. And nothing, nothing at all, could take that away from her. The house stood there in front of her, the same house that had once been a symbol of family, of hard work, and of sacrifice. It had been Margaret's pride, her gift to her son and daughter-in-law. Now, it felt like a weight, a burden that she could no longer carry, not because she didn't love it, but because the love she had poured into it had been misunderstood, misused. Margaret stood at the threshold, her hand resting on the doorframe, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the house that had been hers to give and to take. It had always been hers. The papers, the title, the loan, it was all hers. But now, she would release it. Release it into hands that would use it for what it was meant for. Not a trophy or a possession, but a home. She had made the decision long ago, and today it would be done. Margaret had contacted a transitional housing charity, one that would use the home to provide shelter for those who needed it the most, people who had nowhere to go, no place to call their own. This house would no longer be a space of conflict and resentment. It would be a place of new beginnings. Her footsteps were slow as she made her way through the house for one last time. The rooms were quiet now, echoing with memories but devoid of life. She paused in the kitchen where she had spent countless hours cooking for her family, the smells of Sunday roasts and fresh-baked pies forever imprinted in the walls. The countertops were clean now, stripped of their familiar clutter. The table, once full of laughter and tension, was empty. Margaret had already packed her things. All that was left were a few small touches, reminders of the life she had lived there. She moved quietly from room to room, touching the furniture, the walls. She could almost hear the voices that had once filled the spaces, her son's laughter, Rachel's carefully cultivated tone. But now it was just silence, peaceful, but heavy. In the guest bedroom, Margaret placed a set of clean towels on the bed, neatly folded, as though she were preparing for a guest. She placed a handwritten note beside them, her handwriting steady and calm, as always. "Welcome home. May you find safety here." She stood there for a moment, looking at the note, the towels, the empty room. This wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about Stephen or Rachel or the years she had spent making excuses. It was about what the house could become, about giving someone else the safety that she had hoped her family would appreciate, but never did. Margaret made her way to the front door, her hand brushing the worn wood of the frame as she paused one last time. She had been here too long, clinging to what was no longer hers to keep, and now she would let go. Joyce was waiting for her in the car, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and pride. She had known what this meant to Margaret. She had known the quiet grief of watching something you had built fall apart, and the even quieter relief that came with letting it go. They drove to the charity office where Margaret handed the final deed over to the nonprofit's director, a young woman with wide eyes and a grateful smile. "We're honored to accept this," she said, her voice filled with respect. "You don't know how much this will help." Margaret's lips curved into a soft smile, but there was no triumph in it. "Let someone else feel safe here," she said quietly, the words simple but full of meaning. She wasn't giving away her home. She was passing it on to someone who would cherish it the way it was always meant to be. Joyce, standing beside Margaret, couldn't help the tears that welled up in her eyes. She blinked them back quickly, but Margaret saw the shimmer. "You're doing the right thing," Joyce whispered, squeezing her friend's hand. "You always have." Margaret didn't speak for a moment. She just nodded, the weight of everything lifting from her shoulders. "I wasn't meant to keep it," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion. "I was meant to clear the damage." The director handed her a final form, and Margaret signed it with a quiet but firm hand. When the paperwork was done, the house was officially no longer hers. It was theirs now, for the people who needed it. Later that evening, after they'd left the charity, Margaret stood at the window of her new apartment, her eyes resting on the small garden outside, the plants Joyce had given her growing steadily, their leaves bright in the dimming light. Ava's voice interrupted her thoughts, the soft click of her phone breaking through the silence. Margaret read the message. a small smile tugging at her lips. I kept the key. It's on a ribbon, so I can keep it close. Ava had been the only one to understand, the only one to see Margaret for who she was. Not just a mother, not just a caretaker, but a woman who needed to put herself first for once. Margaret placed the phone down and looked out the window, her heart full, her mind quiet. Ava had always understood what Margaret needed, and now Margaret was beginning to understand it too. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Joyce, her hands empty this time, but her smile warm. Margaret stood slowly, crossing the room to open the door, the familiar comfort of her friend reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. Joyce stepped in, her eyes soft. "I've been thinking about that key," she said with a knowing look. "You're Ava's blueprint now, Margaret." Margaret's smile grew, her chest swelling with something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for so long. Hope. Not just for the future, but for herself. "I suppose I am," she replied, her voice steady and full of purpose. "And I think it's time I finally live by it." And for the first time, Margaret truly believed it. She wasn't just walking away from the past. She was stepping into a future that was all hers. The article came like a quiet storm, hitting the news cycle with a calm power that Margaret hadn't anticipated. It was the kind of peace that belonged to someone who had lived quietly, endured quietly, and had now, finally, chosen to speak. The headline read, "Woman Quietly Reclaims and Repurposes Her Home." Margaret's name was front and center, her story told in succinct, respectful prose, as if it were an ordinary piece of local interest. She read the words slowly, each sentence painting a picture of her decision, of her journey to reclaim her property, and her ultimate choice to donate it to a nonprofit that would give it new purpose. The reporter, a young woman with a gentle but clear-eyed perspective, had captured the essence of Margaret's motivations. It wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility, about taking ownership of the things that mattered. It wasn't flashy, but it was deeply human. Margaret hadn't sought out the publicity. She hadn't expected this. But somehow it felt like the right moment. The article framed her actions in the way Margaret had hoped, quietly, without drama, but with purpose. It was a subtle declaration. She was no longer hiding in the shadows, no longer allowing the past to dictate her future. She sat in the window seat of her new apartment, her fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup in her hand. As the last few lines of the article echoed in her mind, a message came in from Joyce, her phone buzzing on the table beside her. Margaret picked it up and smiled at Joyce's text. "You're finally public for all the right reasons." It was strange, this new visibility. Strange to be seen for once, not through the lens of someone else's expectations or judgments. But Margaret hadn't done this for the recognition. She hadn't done it for anyone else. She had done it for herself, and that was all that mattered. But the quiet peace that came with the article didn't last long. The next morning, Rachel's voice found a way to leak through the cracks of the new life Margaret had so carefully built. Rachel had posted something on social media, a cryptic message that wasn't so cryptic to anyone who knew her. The words hung there in the digital air, sharp and accusing. "Some people weaponize generosity." Margaret stared at the words on her screen, trying to understand them. What had Rachel meant by that? Had she really meant to say that Margaret's actions, her choice to give away the house, were somehow wrong? That Margaret had manipulated the situation? Ava, who had seen the post too, let out a breath. "I guess she doesn't get it, huh?" Margaret didn't respond right away. She set her phone down gently, her fingers hovering over the edge of it as she thought about what Rachel had said. Weaponized generosity. Rachel had always seen things through a different lens. She had seen everything as a transaction. The house, the money, the gifts. It had always been about what you could get in return. Margaret had never looked at it that way. She had given because that's what felt right. But Rachel? Rachel's message had been laced with a bitterness that Margaret couldn't quite decipher. Was it regret? Or was it anger at being out of control? The next part of the story came not from Rachel, but from the world around her. Margaret checked her phone again, the screen now filled with dozens of comments on Rachel's post. The tone had shifted rapidly from confusion to support, and it wasn't long before Rachel's words began to unravel. "Didn't she pay for your house?" one person had commented. Another quickly followed. "Wasn't it her house to give away?" There were others who weighed in, trying to explain the situation, trying to show Rachel a side of things she hadn't understood, about responsibility, about stewardship, about doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. But it was the first comment, the one that questioned Rachel's version of the story, that seemed to strike the hardest. Rachel didn't answer. The post lingered, its meaning slowly shifting under the weight of the crowd's judgment. Margaret could feel the shift even from a distance. It was the first time Rachel's voice had been so publicly questioned, so publicly exposed for what it was. And Margaret, though she had no intention of getting involved in the digital exchange, couldn't help but feel something. A quiet victory? Or just the weight of truth finally being spoken? Stephen's name came up a moment later, though he remained silent. There were no comments from him, no explanations, no apologies. Just his name attached to the controversy, an echo of his wife's words hanging in the air. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't on Margaret. Rachel's post had been deleted by the end of the day, her attempts to silence her own confusion fading into the digital ether. And for the first time, Stephen's voice appeared, apologetic, but direct. "We shouldn't have taken it so personally. I'm sorry, Mom. It was always yours to do with as you saw fit." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words wash over her. A part of her, the mother in her, wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to remind him of how long she had been there for him. But she didn't. This time, there would be no comforting, no fixing what couldn't be fixed. Ava's voice broke through the silence, quiet but resolute. "Mom doesn't get it," she'd said before, but now she said nothing. Ava was finally beginning to understand, too, that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. But they could be rebuilt, just like this new life Margaret had begun to craft for herself. As the evening settled in, Margaret sat by the window, her phone resting quietly on the table in front of her. She had learned, in these past few days, that some things were meant to be released. And while the digital world had its way of keeping her story alive, the real peace was in knowing that she was no longer the one who had to defend her choices. The truth was out there now, whether Rachel, Stephen, or anyone else wanted to admit it. Margaret had made her own choices, and nothing could erase the fact that she had finally taken back her life. The weekend passed quietly, a rare kind of calm that Margaret hadn't experienced in years. It was a slow, uninterrupted rhythm that she hadn't realized she'd been craving until it arrived. Ava had decided to spend the weekend with her, and for once, there were no questions, no underlying tension, no unsaid words between them. It was as if the air between them had cleared, the years of unspoken emotions now gently set aside, leaving room only for peace. They started with cooking together, a simple breakfast of eggs, toast, and coffee. Margaret had long since given up on trying to make everything perfect. Today, they didn't need perfection. They just needed to be. The warm smell of coffee filled the apartment as they worked side by side, Ava cracking eggs into a bowl, Margaret slicing the bread with quiet precision. It felt easy, uncomplicated. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward or strained, but comfortable, like a shared understanding that words weren't always necessary. Margaret watched Ava as she ate, noticing the way her granddaughter's eyes flickered with curiosity, the way she observed everything with the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen more than her years suggested. After breakfast, they took a walk through the small garden outside, their footsteps soft against the earth. Margaret had always loved the way the flowers bloomed in slow succession, each one an unexpected surprise. As they walked, Ava's arm brushed lightly against Margaret's, a small but meaningful gesture of closeness. "Thank you for letting me see all of it," Ava said, her voice thoughtful as they paused by the roses, their petals unfurling in the early afternoon sun. The strength, the line. Margaret stopped walking, turning to face Ava. Her eyes softened, the weight of her experiences passing through her in an instant. "Boundaries aren't rejection," Margaret said, her voice steady but gentle. "They're clarity." Ava looked at her, her expression full of something that could have been admiration, or something deeper. "I want to be more like you," she said, her words almost shy, as if she wasn't sure if it was too much to say. Margaret's smile was small, but it carried an infinite depth of understanding. "Start by knowing where to stop," she said quietly. The words felt like a lesson she had spent her entire life learning, a lesson she had now passed on, in the simplest way possible. Ava nodded, and for the rest of their walk, there were no more words. They didn't need them. It was as if the space between them had finally been cleared, and there was nothing left but understanding. That evening, they spent time curled up in the living room, the glow of the lamp casting a soft light across the room. The quiet hum of the world outside seemed to fade into the background as they watched old black and white films. The screen flickered with the warmth of nostalgia, and the characters on the screen, so full of hope and possibility, seemed to mirror the feeling in the room. Margaret had always loved these films, the way they were simple but full of depth. They didn't need extravagant sets or dramatic effects. They just told stories. Stories of resilience, of love, of clarity. And as she sat beside Ava, watching the flickering images, she realized that this was the story she had been living all along, a story that had come full circle. Ava leaned against her, her breathing slow and steady, a contented sigh escaping her lips as the credits rolled on the screen. Margaret looked down at her granddaughter, her heart full of quiet pride. Ava had always been the one to understand, to see the strength in her, even when Margaret hadn't seen it in herself. And now, as they sat together in the soft glow of the evening, Margaret realized something she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. She had done the right thing. She had finally chosen the life that was hers, and in doing so, she had taught Ava that it was okay to choose yourself too. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Full of love, of understanding, of clarity. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace of it wash over her. The world outside could wait. Inside, in this room, everything was as it should be. The story wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter, pristine and untouched, a small reminder of the past that Margaret had long since let go of. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Rachel's neat, precise scrawl that had always carried with it an undertone of control. Margaret hadn't opened it. She had no intention of opening it. It was a letter from Rachel, no doubt filled with more accusations, more explanations, perhaps even more pleas. It didn't matter anymore. She reached over, slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. For a moment she simply stared at it, letting the quiet settle in. The envelope was an object from a life she was leaving behind, a relic of a version of herself that was no longer needed. Without a second thought, Margaret placed it in a drawer, unopened, and slid it closed. The rest of the day flowed slowly, deliberately. Margaret brewed tea, the familiar rhythm of the task grounding her, bringing her back to herself. She didn't need to worry about the past or the people who would never understand her decisions. She didn't need to justify anything. This was her time. The tea steeped quietly, the warmth filling the small apartment as Margaret sank into her armchair, a book open in her lap. The words on the page were soothing, a quiet escape from the world. She'd spent years giving, years cleaning up after others, years of uncertainty and doubt. But now she could read for hours without feeling that nagging sense that something, someone, was waiting for her to fix it, to make it right. As the soft sound of Billie Holiday filled the air from the record player in the corner, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over her. There was something so tender, so powerful in those old songs, something that mirrored the quiet strength Margaret had been cultivating for so long. "I'll be seeing you." The words seemed to resonate in the room, threading their way into her thoughts like a gentle reminder of all the things she had left behind. And yet, how far she had come. Joyce called, her voice as familiar and comforting as ever. "Aren't you curious what she said?" she asked, the question light but full of meaning. Joyce knew Margaret had kept the letter sealed. She always knew. Margaret smiled softly, stirring her tea. "She said it when she grabbed the plate," Margaret replied, her voice calm and steady, the years of silence in her home ringing louder than any words on a piece of paper ever could. "Everything else is delay." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Margaret could almost hear Joyce's knowing smile. "You're right," Joyce said softly. "She'll never understand." Margaret didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Joyce had always understood. They had both been through so much together, seen each other at their lowest, and now they were seeing each other at their best. Margaret had never asked for much. Just respect. Just the chance to live her life on her terms. And now, finally, she had that. Later that afternoon, Ava came by, her presence like a quiet breath of fresh air. She set down a small bag of groceries on the kitchen counter, the soft clink of cans and bottles a stark contrast to the peaceful stillness of the apartment. Ava sat down beside Margaret, looking at her grandmother with a mixture of curiosity and something else, understanding. Margaret didn't have to explain herself. Ava had already seen it all. "You're not angry anymore," Ava said, her voice gentle, almost as if she was confirming something she had known all along. Margaret took a deep breath, letting the question settle. She wasn't angry anymore. She hadn't been for a long time. The anger had been there, yes, but it had been packed away with everything else she no longer needed. "I packed that emotion and donated it too," Margaret replied with a soft smile, her voice steady but full of finality. She wasn't going to carry it anymore. There was nothing to be angry about now. There was only the present, this moment, and the clarity that had come with making peace with her past. The letter, still in the drawer, was no longer a weight. It wasn't a symbol of the past that needed to be confronted, analyzed, or fought over. It was just an envelope, a small, insignificant piece of paper. The story it held was no longer hers to tell. Ava glanced at the drawer, her eyes lingering there for a moment before meeting Margaret's. Without saying a word, she nodded, understanding everything that wasn't spoken. The letter remained sealed. Margaret didn't need to open it. It would eventually be recycled. Just another piece of the past that could be left behind. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, a feeling of peace settling over her like the softest blanket. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about the letter. It wasn't even about Rachel anymore. It was about her, about the choices she had made, and the freedom she had reclaimed. Ava placed her hand gently over Margaret's, their fingers touching in a quiet moment of connection. "I'm proud of you," Ava whispered, her voice full of sincerity. Margaret smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that had been waiting to emerge for so long. "I'm proud of you too," she said softly. And for the first time, Margaret knew that the room she had created for herself, the space she had fought so hard to protect, was one that would hold no resentment. Only the soft, steady rhythm of a life reclaimed. The kitchen at the community center was alive with warmth, both literal and figurative. The scent of casserole and cornbread wafted through the air, filling the space with the kind of comfort that only homemade food could bring. Margaret moved through the bustling room, placing dishes onto the serving table with careful precision, the soft clink of ceramic plates joining the background hum of conversation and laughter. She worked alongside the volunteers, her hands moving in practiced rhythm. No one asked her for direction, but they looked to her for it, their smiles as much a gesture of respect as they were a testament to the quiet strength she exuded. Margaret wasn't one to raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. Her steady hand, her clear intentions. Those were the things that guided the room. A small smile curled at the corner of her lips as she placed the tea urn in its spot. There was a quiet pride in this moment, in this space. This was what it was all about. The food wasn't just food. It wasn't just about feeding others. It was about nurturing, about creating a space where people could feel seen, feel heard. It was about the warmth that came from a table shared. Joyce stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the scene with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something soft and knowing. Margaret could feel her eyes on her, but it wasn't an uncomfortable weight. It was a validation, a quiet acknowledgement of all the steps Margaret had taken to arrive here. "You know," Joyce said, stepping closer, a small grin on her face. "Look what you've built without a kitchen island." Margaret laughed softly, the sound light and full of a kind of contentment that had been so long absent from her life. "They wanted the house," Margaret replied, glancing around the bustling kitchen, the volunteers working side by side in easy camaraderie. "I wanted a home." Joyce's smile softened, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "You've got one now." Margaret didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded, turning her attention to the final details, the placement of the dessert, the careful arrangement of cups and spoons. Everything had its place, and everything felt right. This was home. It wasn't a house. It wasn't something to own. It was something to create, to nurture, to give away in the most unspoken, beautiful way. Ava entered the room, her face glowing with a quiet energy that seemed to radiate from within. She had always been Margaret's quiet observer, but now, as she helped distribute the dessert to the guests, there was something different in her demeanor, something grounded, something deeply at peace. She wasn't just serving food, she was serving connection, serving the spirit of generosity that Margaret had shown her over the years. Margaret watched her granddaughter move through the room with ease, a natural grace in the way she engaged with everyone. Ava had never asked for validation. She had simply stepped into her place, found her purpose, and offered it to others with the same quiet dignity Margaret had always sought to emulate. The dinner went on, each plate filled with warmth, each conversation filled with genuine laughter. The tension that had so often filled the air during family dinners was nowhere to be found. There were no phone calls, no unresolved arguments, no awkward silences that dragged on too long. It was just warmth, just connection. Margaret sat at the head of the table watching as everyone enjoyed the meal, the quiet hum of conversation flowing around her like a gentle river. It was as though she had finally found the rhythm of her own life, the one that had eluded her for so long. This was what she had been searching for. Not a place to keep, not something to possess, but a place to belong, a place to give. a place to be. Ava finished her task, quietly returning to sit beside her grandmother. She didn't say much, but her smile spoke volumes. She understood, in her own way, what this moment meant. Not just for Margaret, but for their family, for everyone who had ever walked through these doors. Margaret reached over and placed a hand on Ava's. "You did well today," she said softly, her voice full of quiet pride. Ava's eyes softened as she squeezed Margaret's hand in return. The night carried on, filled with the quiet hum of contentment. The sound of forks scraping across plates, the murmur of voices. Margaret felt it all settle into her like a long-forgotten comfort. The house had once been a space filled with conflict, filled with expectations that were never truly hers. But now, the space she had created was full of warmth, her warmth, not dictated by anyone else. And as she looked at the people gathered around the table, Ava, Joyce, the volunteers, Margaret felt a sense of peace, not just for herself, but for the house she had let go of. It had served its purpose, had given everything it could. Now it was someone else's turn to fill the walls with their own memories. Margaret rose slowly from the table, her hand resting gently on the back of her chair as she looked around the room. The keys, the ones she had once held so tightly, were no longer a burden to her. They were someone else's to return, and she was at peace with that. The final line of her journey. At dinner, my daughter-in-law snatched the plate from my hands. The next day, the keys were hers to return, was no longer a painful truth, but a quiet reminder that some things were always meant to be returned. Not out of spite, but out of respect. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret knew that the table she had built was one that would finally feel right.